As hunters relentlessly pursue majestic creatures for their coveted furs, horns, or meat, the animals they target sometimes possess an uncanny ability to turn the tables. Every now and again, the hunter unwittingly becomes the hunted. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. In today's episode, we go over 3 times animals took revenge on hunters. Welcome to Final Affliction.
Talon and Wyatt Brooks knew the woods of Georgetown like the back of their hand. The brothers had been hunting here with their father since they could remember. Before either of them were allowed to lift a rifle, Mr. Brooks made sure that they could track, skin, and process every single inch of the animal that they were after. Only when they were 15 did they first get to shoot down a buck. The Brooks boys learned from the best, and they lived for the wilderness. Even outside of hunting season, they'd still go camping. Talon, now 21, had a packed schedule with college classes and keeping a part-time job. But on the rare occasion that he could get a weekend off, he'd stop by his childhood home to pick up his 18-year-old brother and their father for some time outside. On the 23rd of March, 2024, Mr. Brooks was held up at work, but Talon had a lucky break. He wouldn't have to go into work for the night shift, but Talon and Wyatt didn't mind. It would have been nicer to have their father with them, but they could get along without him just fine. It wouldn't be the first time they headed off on their own, after all. While the snow was still on the ground, the only thing available to hunt was the wild boars. If all went well, the boys would bring back 1 or 2 boars home to process, filling the freezers nicely until spring came and the bigger bucks were open for hunting again. But mostly they were there for the shed antlers that were all over the place at that time of the year. They arrived at one of their favorite camping spots, hidden just off the road in the woods. They spent the first hour chatting merrily as they set up camp, got everything ready for that night's fire, and set up dinner. They were planning on going back home the very next day, so the fire was more for warmth than cooking purposes. They had plenty of food for 2 strapping young men packed for them by their mother that morning. Since the afternoon was still young, they decided to head out to see if they could get 1 or 2 pigs before nightfall, and sure enough, they got a fantastic boar within 2 hours. They even managed to find 3 good-sized antlers, too. The rest of the afternoon was spent dressing the pig out in the field and carrying it back to their campsite. They left the entrails out for the scavengers to clear up for them. Wyatt was the one who brought the boar down, something he wasn't going to let his older brother live down anytime soon. They cleaned up in a nearby stream and headed off to bed for the night. While they slept, the guts and hooves that they left behind for the scavengers attracted its fair share of critters. Among the voles and a lone coyote, there was also a mountain lion. She chased the rest away from what little was left, but the scraps were barely enough to fill her belly. The predator tracked the scent of the pig all the way back to the campsite where the boys slept, but she kept her distance. The smell of the carcass was tantalizing, but within that delicious smell was also the odor of fire and humans. She nearly built up enough courage to go up to the camp, but just then Wyatt stepped out of the tent to relieve himself. She slunk back into the woods and decided to wait until the men made a move in the morning. If they left, then she could get close enough to make away with a piece or a whole carcass. The night dragged on, but sure enough, the morning dawned, and the boys were outside as soon as the sun came up. The watcher retreated a little farther back, never taking her eyes off them. She'd taken shelter right up against a boulder where a thicket of brushes grew high enough to shield her from sight. When they'd finished a quick breakfast, checked on the carcass, and made sure that their rifles were in working order, the boys headed out again. But the cat didn't bank on them heading off straight into the woods toward her. She knew that the humans usually kept to the pathways, but now, with Wyatt in the lead, they were making a beeline toward her hiding place. The men were fast approaching, and the nervous cat let out a low growl. At first, Wyatt thought it was a truck passing by. They were close enough to the road that it would be possible. He simply kept walking, not thinking anything of it. He came just 5 feet from the cat's hiding spot before he even saw her. But by then, it was too late. Mad with fear, hunger, and unwilling to be cornered by anyone or anything, she leapt out of the bushes before Wyatt could even take up his rifle. Her claws were unsheathed, and she pounced with deadly accuracy. If it weren't for Wyatt's heavy winter jacket, her claws would have ripped his chest to shreds. The same couldn't be said for his uncovered face. The animal sank her teeth into the soft tissue of his cheek, knocking him over with the force of her full weight flying into him. Talon managed to get the chance to raise his firearm, but his little brother and his attacker were intertwined with each other that he would have shot Wyatt if he attempted it. Instead, Talon did the only thing he could do. He threw down his gun and launched himself at the screaming chaos of writhing limbs and blood. Talon tackled the beast like he would have hit an opponent on the football field. This time the mountain lion was the one being catapulted through the air. In midair, before they even hit the forest floor, Talon yelled at his brother to run. Wyatt, holding the flap that used to be his cheek to his face, ran through the woods half blind. He didn't know it yet, but his left eye was somewhere beneath his crushed cheekbone. With Talon's screams and the cat's wild cries behind him, Wyatt reached the camp in minutes. He grabbed the nearest phone from the tent, and with his bloody fingers slipping on the screen, he managed to dial 911. Wyatt didn't remember it later, but he did manage to relay to the operator what was going on and what their location was. But then, with the woman still on the line, he passed out cold, finally giving in to the shock, pain, and fear that just overloaded his system. That's where emergency services found him lying at the door of their little 2-man tent. Wyatt didn't regain consciousness as he was driven away in the ambulance. The team that stayed behind didn't have to search long to find Talon. Just a few meters away from the camp, they found him, unmoving on the ground, with a cougar standing over him. The officer's shots rang through the air, and she bolted back into the trees. They were not aiming for the cat. Like Talon, they didn't want to risk shooting the man instead of the cat, but it wouldn't have mattered anyway. Talon's throat had been ripped out, and his entire upper body was so destroyed that it was evident that she'd started eating at his soft tissues before they'd even arrived. The trackers found her before the day was out. The cat was euthanized, and her necropsy was done mostly to satisfy the necessary paperwork. When they found her, Talon and Wyatt's blood was still wet on her muzzle. There's no question that they got the right cat. Wyatt is still looking at more surgeries than any boy should have to face in their lifetime. He's stable and expected to make a full recovery. The entire left side of his face will have to be reconstructed, and there's no word out yet on whether or not they'll be able to save his eye. And unfortunately, he'll be confined to the hospital for the next few weeks, so he won't be able to attend his one and only brother's funeral. Talon sacrificed his life to save his brother's, but tragically, it resulted in his terrifying final affliction. Christ was an experienced outdoorsman and an expert trapper. He regularly trapped in Alaska and was knowledgeable in outdoor survival and weaponry. He enjoyed the solitude that the outdoors gave him, the adventure of living off the land amongst nature in the great outdoors. In February 1939, he set out to Prince of Wales Island. The island covers an area of about 2,500 square miles. Today, it is popular with the tourism industry for the excellent hiking trails, camping, and fishing that it offers. Christ followed the Thorn River upstream to his favorite trapping spots. He took with him enough provisions to last him a couple of months in the wilderness. He had recently bought a top-of-the-line Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver. This would likely have cost him the equivalent of $1,500 in today's money. They were relatively new at the time, perhaps only 5,000 manufactured by then. But Chris knew his guns, and he knew the importance of carrying such a firearm in the outdoors. He trudged through the snow alongside the river. After 10 miles, he finally made it to the cabin. This would be his home for the next couple of months. He unpacked his belongings and set about making a fire. The little cabin warmed up quickly, and Christ settled into life in the wilderness. Over the next few weeks, he continued his daily ritual of checking the previous day's traps and setting new ones. Venturing out from his cabin each day, he knew the area well. He enjoyed the excitement of trapping the animals and then taking them back to the cabin to be skinned and butchered. He had a fine collection and wasted nothing of each animal. On March 2nd, Christ left his cabin never to return. He packed for the day. He loaded his pistol into his holster, and his knife was secured onto his belt. The snow was beginning to melt, and the forest foliage was beginning to burst into life as spring was just around the corner. The following is based on circumstantial evidence presented by investigators at the time. It is one of a few explanations into the disappearance of Christ, and the dramatization of the story has been provided based on similar incidents and what is known of animal attacks. Christ had walked a few miles from his cabin. He had been checking his traps, which he had set along the Thorn River. His little rowboat was tied up in the river. He couldn't use it yet as the lake was still frozen over, but it would come in handy as the weather warmed up in the coming weeks. Then he would be able to fish in the middle of the lake and travel more easily to the far side. As he neared the lake, he heard a noise. He stood still and pricked his ears, listening hard. He had heard the snap of a twig. He knew there was something nearby. He unclipped his revolver from his holster and loaded it. But as he did so, he noticed the mainspring was broken. He unloaded the gun, placing the bullets into his pocket, and checked it over again. As he did so, he heard another sound. He looked up. He saw the imposing outline of a wolf 100 yards away. It stood, half concealed by a tree, its eyes locked onto Christ. It had been watching him. The tip of its nose twitched. Christ slowly backed up. His revolver was useless now. He placed it back into his holster, never taking his eyes off the wolf. He was in an area of smaller trees. They were thin and spindly. He knew he couldn't climb one if the wolf advanced, but there were larger trees on the other side of the lake that he could. He had seen wolves before. In the past, they had been shy and timid. He usually caught a glimpse of one as it ran away, spooked by his presence. But this time, it was different. This time, the wolf was bold. It was brazened. It was hunting him. Then, to his horror, he noticed another wolf amongst the trees to his right, and another to his left. He was surrounded. They began advancing towards him. He stepped backwards onto the frozen lake. The snow crunched under his feet. He pulled out his knife from its leather sheath and held it in front of him. It was now his only form of defense. With his heart in his mouth, he slowly retreated backwards across the lake. As the wolf pack followed him and stepped out of the tree line, Christ decided to make a run for it. He was a fit young man, 40 years old and in good physical shape. He threw his backpack onto the ice and sprinted to the other side of the lake. As he took off, the wolf's instinct kicked in, and they immediately chased him. Hot on his heels, they covered the open frozen lake in no time. Christ just about made it to the other side and desperately tried to scramble up a large tree. As he leapt for a low-lying branch, one of the wolves jumped at him. It grabbed him and knocked him to the ground. Christ tried to fight them off with his knife. He landed several blows, but there were too many of them. The attack lasted minutes. It was ferocious and brutal. Then Christ was still. It wasn't until 4 months later, in July, that he was reported missing. He was known to go trapping for months at a time in Alaska, so his disappearance wasn't noted earlier. But his friends grew concerned when they had heard nothing from him since March. The United States Commissioner sent 2 men to search for Christ. They found his cabin and searched the area thoroughly. They came across his rowing boat, still tied upstream from the lake, but there was no sign of the woodsman. They decided that a search for Christ, if he had passed away, would be hopeless amongst all the summer foliage. They collected up his belongings from the cabin and sent them back to Ketchikan, from where Christ was from. Chris's friends were unhappy with the outcome of the search. They demanded that more was done to find their friend. So, they assembled another search party. The expedition was led by former game warden W.R. Selfridge. He took with him equipment that would enable them to drag the lake's floor in case his body was at the bottom. But it was now October. This was 7 months after it was believed Chris last left his cabin. Their search was incredibly thorough. They found the cabin on October 30th, and almost a week later, on November 5th, they found what they believed to be some of Chris's remains and torn clothing. It's possible Chris died of a heart attack or some other illness, but evidence suggested that he was pursued and then eaten by a pack of wolves. The most important pieces of information that were discovered were the sheathed knife and the revolver. The knife had wolf bite marks on its handle and was found on the lake's shoreline, not in its sheath, along with some torn clothing. Bone fragments and an almost complete skull were found 50 yards along with the holstered revolver. It is possible a wolf managed to take the knife out of its leather sheath and drop it by the shore as it was scavenging Chris's remains, but it seems more likely that Chris took the knife out of its protective cover in order to use it himself. On inspection of the gun, the team found the main spring in the revolver was broken. The gun was unloaded. From this, they suggested that Chris had only discovered the faulty handgun once he had already left the cabin. There would have been no point in carrying a broken gun with him. The fact that it was unloaded suggests that he had tried to fix it. There were no witnesses of Chris's death. It seemed he had died alone. There was no chance of finding the wolves responsible and taking DNA samples to verify the attack. His case remains largely unsolved, but the suggestion of a wolf attack, given the evidence, seems a plausible explanation. At the time of the investigation, there had been no fatalities caused by wolves that had been recorded. What were thought to be Chris's remains were collected and buried in the Ketchikan Cemetery. There is no date of birth marked at the grave, nor a date of death. Those details will remain unknown, as well as the explanation for his untimely final affliction. On June 22, 1892, two brothers, 23-year-old Hiram Nagel and his younger brother George Nagel, had been tasked with the upkeep of one of their family ranches in Mexico. The family were Mormon settlers, chased out of Missouri in the United States and forced to retreat in the obscure Mexican state of Chihuahua. Despite being over 100,000 square miles, the population in the state was barely 20,000 people. This meant that humans were somewhat of an anomaly among the wildlife of this vast geographical area. Animals like deer, cougars, raccoons, and foxes constituted a majority of the fauna of the state. But one large animal roamed as the apex predator of this food chain. The grizzly bear weighed over 600 pounds and could grow to more than 2 meters in length. Armed with 42 teeth over 3 inches in length, it was capable of tearing apart flesh and devouring its prey in a single sitting. George and Hiram noticed just a few weeks in that their ranch had attracted predators from the wider area, and the cattle and farm animals were being hunted one by one. George reported once witnessing a very large brown bear close to their farm one day on his way back from the river. Their losses started to mount into the thousands of dollars by today's money, and the boys knew they had to do something about it. The two brothers armed their rifles, got on their horses, and ventured out about 15 miles, scanning the area for bears. As they went further away from the ranch, the magnitude of the bear attack soon became apparent, with paw prints leading to scattered carcasses of goats and cattle. George and Hiram decided that it would be best to split up and look for the bear individually to shoot it at first sight. They were treading along the Gavilan River, which led to a small canyon. To the side of the hill, George noticed a large brown bear in the distance and immediately yelled at Hiram to group closer for the kill. They got off their horses and took an aim straight for the large furry animal. Hiram took several shots with his Winchester rifle, and George took aim for the bear's head. They opened fire from a considerable distance and were confident that the animal would soon succumb to its injuries. The bear was hit in the torso and legs and limped further behind the canyon, trying to escape the burst of gunshots. Before it disappeared behind the rocks, George took one more chance and set another bullet in the bear's direction. The animal bawled in pain and tried to run away. It collapsed a few times before getting up to stagger a few steps further. George's rifle cartridge got stuck, with one misfired bullet jammed behind another. The bear laid still on the ground in the distance, and George took the time to unjam his gun using a pocket knife. Hiram yelled in cheer, announcing the death of the nuisance, and called George to follow him closer. The canyon ahead was at a slight elevation, and Hiram hurried to it before George could fix his rifle. As Hiram went further ahead, closer to the bear, George heard 3 more gunshots. He thought Hiram had fired the final kill shots and jogged to where his brother had gone. However, when he arrived at the top of the hill, he could see no sign of his brother or the bear. George yelled Hiram's name, but heard nothing in response. He looked down and saw the bear's footprints where he thought it had died, continued further into the distance, signaling that it was still alive. There was another low rise on the canyon, and George went in to take a closer look at the wider view from above. Then he finally noticed it, the bear still alive, chewing on something in the distance. Hiram's blue shirt just a few feet from the bear now made it clear to George what had just happened. He screamed for his brother and tried to scare the bear away. The animal had chewed off Hiram's hand, which momentarily pacified it, and ran away. George hurried toward his brother, who was losing blood fast and had deep bite wounds all over his body. He was dripping in blood as his consciousness started to slip away. But then he noticed the bear coming back from the side. George aimed his rifle and took one final shot as it charged towards them. The bullet from the close distance hit its thigh, and the bear tried to claw its way up a tree, but it had now been severely injured and dropped to the ground, writhing in pain. George walked up close to it and shot one final round straight into the bear's head. The animal was finally dead. George worriedly stumbled back to his brother, and that's when the true gravity of his injuries became clear to him. Hiram was maimed and mangled by the giant grizzly bear. His neck had deep bite marks of the animal's 3-inch-long canine front teeth. His scalp was peeled off from the front. His skull was punctured from the right, leaking his brain fluid. Hiram's hand had been completely bitten off, and his entire torso was a bloody and horrifying sight of wounds, cuts, and bite marks. Young George realized the predicament he now found himself in, trapped 15 miles from their ranch in the middle of the wilderness and the threat of more predators, while his brother's life slipped away with every passing second. Hiram was in excruciating pain, but was able to mumble a few words explaining what happened to him. He had attempted to come up from behind the bear, who had been shot several times and was presumably dead. But the bear had lied, crouched down in disguise, waiting to ambush him. As he got closer, the bear lunged at him with great force. The large mass of black furs suddenly engulfed his sight, and all his frantic attempts to shoot the bear as it charged at him misfired. It then bit into the back of his neck and stomped its front paws on his frail chest with its body weight. He was in dire straits, and George urged him to muster up all the strength he could for the 15-mile horse ride back home. George took off his hat and used it to carry water from the nearby river to wash off his brother's wounds. With a makeshift tourniquet, he wrapped his head, leg, and hand with a piece of cloth to try and prevent Hiram from bleeding out. They were able to finally make the long journey back to their ranch, but Hiram had fainted several times and was barely able to speak. His wounds started stiffening, and the fear of an infection was a very real danger. George realized that his brother's condition would only get worse if they stayed in the middle of the deserted wilderness with no health care. They had to make a long journey to their home in another state. Hiram's condition warranted no optimism that he would survive such a trip, but he pleaded his brother George not to leave him behind, as these may be his final moments. George made the tough call. He wrapped Hiram in blankets and saddled him on top of the horse. There was no time to waste. He got on himself and led the horse the entire night to home. They finally made it to the city, but Hiram's condition had now further deteriorated because of the lack of food and water during their long journey. At the city, they gathered medical professionals. Doctors from neighboring towns came with medicines to stop the spread of infection, but nothing seemed to be effective. The next day, Hiram's infection started spreading to other parts of his body. There were no antibiotics yet invented that could save him, and he was left at the mercy of time. In the morning, he looked at all his family members in the room one more time. With a gaze that spoke of his helplessness, his eyes darted around at the people that loved him the most. Slowly, they closed, and he was only able to draw in a few more breaths before slipping away. After a grueling bear attack, 23-year-old Hiram finally succumbed to his injuries and died. His family in the room knew they had just witnessed their beloved son and brother pass away before their very eyes and were left devastated and inconsolable. Hiram's 19-year-old wife wept for him, but George told her and the family of the heroic resilience he displayed throughout the tragic ordeal before his unfortunate final affliction.